The corridor smelled of damp stone and iron, and Elena felt the words strike her like a physical blow. The Lycan alpha vampires are waiting to kill him. They weren't thoughts. They were a confluence of breath and metal, a half-uttered order, the scrape of a boot, the hush between two centuries, and when Russian braided through them, her curse unclenched, and she understood everything exactly as it would happen. Her fingers went white on the worn banister. Somewhere ahead, a torch guttered, and Victor's name, spoken like a verdict, hammered through her. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. She had no right to be in the fortress. The old stones belonged to ghosts and treaties and men who kept their hearts locked behind ritual as tightly as their doors. Elena should have been across town in her small workshop, hunched over cracked sigils and brittle wards that paid for her bread. Instead, she moved like a shadow along a vaulted wall because the whispering found her even when she tried not to be found. Her curse, her gift, depending on the mood of the night, drew her to thin sounds like a moth to a lamp. Tonight, the lamp was death. Victor Orlov stood 2 cells away, hands cuffed with iron that smelled faintly of blood and lavender, the latter because someone had insisted on a courtesy in the ancient fashion before a trial. He was stripped to the waist in the cold, a bruise stitching his jaw, dark hair plastered to his temples, and the way the jail light cut across his shoulders made him look both feral and broken. The Pax Alpha had always been a presence, something like a storm contained in a human body. Exile had not erased that. In this light, he was smaller, narrower, but his shoulders still remembered how to hold a line. His jaw worked as he listened to the distant clatter of feet, unaware of the real threat threading toward him. Elena's voice was a rustle. "Victor." He flinched at the sound, eyes sliding up, searching the gloom. Recognition smoldered there, surprise, then 1,000 shards of memory. He had seen her once before when the world had been sharper with fear. A translator's hands stilled a dying ward with a whispered litany while he bled on the earth. She had saved him, back when he believed in politics and pacts and gentle, improbable graces. He had not been able to repay her then. Exile and blood took their own measures. "Elena," he said, low, a voice that could have been a plea or a prayer. "I'm here because I listen," she said. Her words felt treacherous in the silence. They were whispering in Russian. It cut through everything. They're planning. He didn't wait for her to finish. His body moved with the economy of a man used to making decisions when wolves answered to his word. Stretch, stand, measure. Tell me. Her curse forced the world into unwanted clarity. She'd always heard the small things. The scraping of chainmail like dry leaves, a guard's throat clearing when lies were near, the tiny intake of breath that marked a secret about to be swallowed. Usually, the language that unstitched itself in her head was a riddle. Tonight, it was a blade. She told him what she'd heard without decoration, the syllables crisp. The Lycan alpha vampires are waiting to kill him. They know the time of the escort. Someone inside is turning them. Victor's brow furrowed. Alpha vampires. The phrase carried a contempt that was equal parts history and new coincidence. The vampires were not merely predators. They were the court, the ancient council that made law out of fangs and binding seals. Cassian Moreau sat at the apex of that court, elegant, cold, and older than most of the treaties binding shifters and immortals. Victor had signed a blood pact with Cassian years ago to protect his pack. The same pact had been twisted into a noose that sent him into exile. "Do you think it's a trap?" he asked. She did not want to say yes, not because she believed in his invulnerability, she did not, but because the truth had teeth that would bite both of them. It could be. It could also be real. Victor closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat he was the young man who had believed a court could be honest if you kept your bargains clean. If it's a ruse to draw me out, they'll offer a spectacle, they'll make an example and call it justice. He spit the word like bile. If it's real, they'll kill me and then erase every trace of the pact. My pack will fracture beyond repair. Elena felt the old grief curl up in her chest like smoke. She knew what exile had done to him, shaved him of his claim, left him with a hollow where leadership should have been. She also knew what Cassian's court wanted. Consolidation, fear, a tight leash on chaos. Victor's death would do what treaties could not. It would terrify the Lycans into obedience. "You can go," she whispered, though every fiber of her rebelled at the thought. Her hands flexed around the banister as though she could leave an imprint. "Run. Get out before the procession. If you go south, you might make it past the river." He laughed then, not humor, but a raw thing that tore at her. "And abandon my pack? After all I've done? After everything?" "Would it be abandoning them, or would it be survival?" she countered. Her cough came out thin. Survival was a word with teeth too, but some days she could not tell whether saving someone was worth endangering everyone else. A noise shivered down the corridor. 2 guards passed. Their boots were pins of sound in her hearing, edging the air. They spoke, light and thoughtless, and Elena heard the rustle. A name, a date, a mention of public. Her stomach dropped. A public execution meant witnesses, spectacle, someone to record the law and write its lies. Cassian would not waste the stage. Victor's face hardened. "There must be a choice," he said. "We can't let them kill me to keep the rest's fear alive." "There's always a choice," she told him, a brittle joke she did not feel. He stepped closer, so close she could see the small scar on his lip that had nothing to do with exile, a remnant of an old fight where he had saved someone who didn't know him. "What do you, Elena?" His voice softened in a way that made her ears burn. It was not the Alpha demanding answers. It was simply Victor, stripped of titles, asking the human question, "What do you need from me?" She could have answered with the truth, the bloody, shameful thing. "I want you to live. I want you to stay. I want the thrum of your breath beside mine, to rebuild a life with you." Instead, she said, "Information." It was thinner armor, but necessary. "Tell me where they'll hold the trial. Who guards it? If it's Cassian's doing, I need the names." He fed her the details with a grim economy. The trial would be in the lower hall at dawn, a hollow space that echoed with oaths. A procession would march him through the courtyard. There would be 3 vampires on the dais, clothed in ceremonial crimson. Names meant little in the court catalog of immortals, but patterns mattered. An older guard with a limp, a scribe who always sat to the left, a young vampire who wore wolf scent like a joke to keep old rivals off balance. As he spoke, Elena's hearing throbbed, each detail a pulse that left her drained. She had once translated treaties that held the thin skeleton of peace between races, and the precision came back to her in muscle memory. Dates, rituals, loopholes. She cataloged the risk, weighed it with the relentless rationality that had kept her alive through decades of listening. When Victor finished, the dilemma sat between them like a third presence. If he fled, he might survive, and his pack might splinter into survival chaos. If he stayed and turned himself into a martyr, the wolves would shudder and submit. A chain tightened around their throats. If they tried to flee together, which was what her heart urged, they risked being hunted as fugitives, each step a possible betrayal by a sympathizer to the court. She thought of Cassian, a man who wore contempt like jewelry and expected loyalty as tax. Cassian had power and patience in spades. He would set the world to right in his image, and Victor's death was a neat, satisfying arrangement in that calculus. He would also, if it suited him, offer Elena safety, a gilded cage, in exchange for loyalty, or worse, for information about who else listened. "You're thinking of taking me to the embankment," Victor said. "They'll use the river crossing. It's ceremonial. If I was to disappear there, then Cassian would say I struck a bargain he couldn't refuse," Elena finished for him. Her mind conjured the image, Victor vanishing under the sweep of black water while the court pronounced justice. The image felt obscene and inevitable. He looked at her like a man who had been given a blade and not told where it would cut him. "Can you get us through the wards?" She hesitated. Her livelihood was wards, the brittle sigils that held back things that should be allowed free. But the fortress's enchantments were old, tangled in law and binding magics designed to humiliate and hold. She could mend a fraying knot, perhaps misdirect the patrol shifts, maybe even whisper a counterspell so the escort would stall. Those were acts that would unmake a lot of things, including her own safety. "I'm not a thief," she said, "but I can make a mistake look like a weather event. The southern gate has a channel for the water ropes. I can blunt the signal on the bells. They'll think it's a storm's fault. It will buy you time." Victor's face broke into something raw and bewildering. "You do that for me?" She swallowed. The truth rose like a tide she could not dam. "I owe you." It was as close to confession as she could stand in the stone-cold light of the cell corridor. "And there's something else." Her voice tasted like iron. "I don't trust that silence. If words can be weapons, I will use them for once." He studied her then, eyes traveling the long history written in the set of her mouth, the small nervous gesture of fingers that always wanted to touch protections as if they were talismans to be soothed. In his gaze, she saw gratitude, suspicion, and something painfully like longing, the knowledge that either could offer the other salvation or ruin. Down the corridor, a distant laugh, a bad, bright thing, told Elena the schedule was shifting. Time narrowed. Their choices were no longer philosophical. They were immediate, and each path smelled faintly of blood. Victor made his decision with the slow, terrible clarity of someone who had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. "We try for the embankment," he said. "But if we're stopped, I stand in the square. I die in public, and the pack may survive. If we make it, we try to broker something new." Her heart folded in on itself. He spoke like a man willing to sacrifice what he had for what could be saved. A leader's logic, brutal and cold. Elena had never been an alpha. Her power was small and dangerous and private. It was the ability to hear truths people tried to bury, and the skill to stitch wards that were ancient as regret. Now the choice she had to make would use both in a way she had not intended. "Then prepare," she said. "I'll make the bell slack. We leave in 3 watches. We'll take the river when the procession crosses. If Cassian wants a show, we will not give him one." She could feel the price of the decision unspool beneath her skin. It hummed with possibility and pain, and in that hum was something like hope, fragile and foolish and fiercely, ferociously human. They moved like conspirators in a world that had outlawed conspiracies. Elena slipped back into the shadow of a buttress while Victor flexed his wrists inside the iron cuffs and listened to the fortress breathe. Outside, the city was a constellation of dull lights and secret markets where people traded favors and curses with equal gravity. Inside the fortress, the air tasted of old vows. Their plan felt ridiculous. A woman who could hear secrets, a man who had been stripped of everything, and a handful of borrowed minutes. But plans live in the small things. A slackened bell, a misread patrol, a guard who took too long to put out a torch, those were the hinges of fate. "Do you trust me?" Victor asked, and his voice carried curiosity like an accusation. She thought of the winter night had knelt in freezing rain and bled into the soil rather than cry for warmth, of how he had once put a treaty over his own hunger to keep 10 others alive. She thought of how exile had hollowed him but had not melted the core of him. "I trust what I hear," she said finally, "and I trust what I can do with it. I don't know your heart, Victor, but I know what you have done." "That will have to be enough," he said. They spent the next hour like thieves in history, hands working on old knots and older magics that Elena had studied in the margins of treaty books. She murmured phrases that weren't quite language and not quite song, a sound history had adopted as law, and the fortress hummed in reluctant answer. The wards were stubborn, woven with a prideful sort of cruelty that made Elena's fingers tingle, but she pried at them with patient pressure. Here she was at her best, small, precise violence that unhooked bitterness from stone. Victor kept watch while she worked. He was quiet in the way of men who had learned to hold emotion like a blade behind their ribs, always ready, always measured. When she needed a voice to translate the old syllables, he supplied a warmth that made her insides ache, a low cadence to match the rune's syntax. It was a ridiculous, intimate collaboration, flesh and hearing, muscle and whisper. And each time their hands brushed against the same knot, she felt an electric recollection of the night she had first tended him, a memory she had never let herself treasure. The closeness both healed and threatened to undo her. There was comfort in the easy rhythm of work and a dislocating hunger in the way his shoulder brushed her arm. "2 more adjustments," she breathed, "but we need a diversion. The Southern Bell's clock is synchronized with the watch's rounds. If we slow the clock, the escort will stall. If we stall the escort, we get the river." He nodded. A diversion, something small. Her curse was a double-edged thing. She could hear secrets, but she could also make sound into lie. She thought of the sentry with the limp who always complained about his knee. She thought of the scribe who drank too much and loved song, who would follow a melody into trouble. She could play to their little habits, exploit the petty human mechanisms that made immortal courts possible. "I can fake a storm," she said. "A little echo on the stones, a rolling of knuckles along the old drain line. It'll cause enough confusion to slow a procession without arousing Cassian's full attention." "Do it," Victor said. There was an urgency to his voice that sharpened the edges of the plan into teeth. She set a small charm at the base of a gargoyle mouth, harmless if you didn't know how to set it, dangerous if you did. The charm would vibrate, a small human mimicry of rain on the southern gutters, a sound that would travel through the masonry and be mistaken for water running heavy. It was the kind of craft the old attendants trusted. Elena used to trade such small deceptions for coin. Tonight, it felt like theft from history. When the charm settled into place, she let herself breathe. For a sliver of time, she allowed herself weakness, a thought that drifted dangerously into wanting. Victor watched her with something like relief carved across his face, both because hope was a welcome change from fear, and because, perhaps, her presence felt like a tether to the world he'd lost. He reached into his sleeve, a small, deft motion, and produced a scrap of cloth, old and smelling faintly of smoke. He handed it to her without pretense. "For your hands," he said. She took it, unprepared for how the contact would cause a little seismic shift in the space between them. His fingers, large and warm, closed over hers for the fraction of a heartbeat necessary to move the cloth. It was absurd, a thing so domestic in a corridor designed for punishment, and it made her feel naked in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "We need to think about contingencies," she said. and tried to steady the tremor in her voice. "There are always contingencies," he said. His mouth softened. "But we have one advantage." She searched his face. "Which is?" "You don't belong to them." There was more in his words than she liked, an admission that cut both ways. On the one hand, it was praise. She was outside the court's net. On the other, it was a reminder of her fragility. Without the vampire's patronage, she had few forms of protection. "You flatter me," she replied, but the laugh sounded brittle even to her own ears. Outside, a bell tolled once, the fortress clocks marking an hour they had no right to claim. Elena felt the charm purr in her palm and then die, as if it had been a small creature that had quietly surrendered. The sounds outside shifted. Men shuffled and murmured. The mechanism worked. "A storm," a guard muttered further down the corridor. "Funny time for weather." "Aye," another said. "Lucky the court has mercy." Elena's heart did a clumsy thing, reminding her that even the best-laid plans existed under a live lyre of panic. They moved then because the single rule in their universe was movement. To stall was to die, to stand was to be judged. Victor's cuffs were still cold around his wrists as they descended into the low hall where the trial would be held, a place that smelled of old wine and fresher fear. Statues along the way watched, their stone eyes reflecting a human tendency to give human faces to immorality. The hall was already arranged. Red cloth draped the dais where Cassian's retinue would sit like vultures waiting for the sun to go down. Servants trailed like anxious ghosts. The crowd was a tangle of many faces, Lycans with faces pulled tight in confusion, humans whose eyes darted like rots, vampires whose smiles were surgical. Elena's ears were a map of threat. She could tell who had been bribed by the court and who had been bought by fear. The whispering rose around them as they passed, and for a moment Elena's curse expanded into an ocean. She had trained herself to swim in such currents, to find the undercurrent that had to be caught if you were to avoid drowning. "Stay close," she told Victor. "I'll move through the crowd." He squeezed her hand in agreement, a small, fierce gesture. It felt like promising to anchor a ship in stormy water. They separated. She walked like a woman with place and purpose, invisible in her intent while she catalogued the voices. Her hearing caught a laugh, Cassian's, smooth and amused as silk rubbing against chain. And in the same breath, she found another thread, the young vampire who wore wolf's scent, the one who liked to show bravado to men like Victor. He moved like a wasp, poised to sting in attention-getting ways. Elena recognized him from her earlier list. He would be on the dais, playing the fiddle of provocation until his masters cut the strings. She needed him to be distracted. In the press, Elena spotted the scribe she had been told to watch, a man with ink-stained fingers and a defect in his hearing that caused him to lean into any story that was loud enough. He always carried a flask and loved gossip. He was the perfect mark. Elena seized the moment. She sang, quietly and deliberately, a sound most people misheard as a hum. It threaded through the crowd like a fishing line. The scribe followed it, as predictable as tide. The young vampire sniffed the air and went to investigate, hoping for the drama of correcting a petty thief and earning applause. Cassian, amused, watched the unfolding as if the world were a chessboard and he, a child, moving a queen. The scribe stumbled into the young vampire's path with a clumsy apology and a flask offering that smelled like fermented fruit and regret. The vampire's fury was delicious to witness. He puffed and postured, drawing attention like a peacock. Guards turned. A small scuffle flared as the young vampire patted his pockets and found nothing of consequence. It was precise and perfect. Elena felt the plan's lattice tighten. The procession slowed. Guards moved to intervene, and the watch's rhythm missed a beat. The bell at the southern gate, now misheard as storm, chimed an extra time, and the signal slipped. Victor seized the moment. He whispered to a pair of men he had known in other lives, faces that carried loyalty like a second skin. And in the confusion, they stepped aside, creating a path that led to a narrow stair winding toward the embankment. It was a risky move. Any betrayal, and the crowd would close like a mouth. But Victor's men moved with the quiet command of those who had once followed him into the wild. Elena's heart stuttered with relief as she watched them pass through the throng. For a few breaths, survival felt possible. She wanted to go with them, to step into freezing water and hope it washed away more than blood. But the rules of the world had taught her that one person could not carry everything. Her gift tethered her to this place as much as Victor's honor had bound him to his pack. As the group slipped away toward the river, she turned to watch Cassian. The vampire prince was still on the dais, smiling like a man who expected the sky to bend to his hand. His eyes met hers, and in them she read a cold that had nothing to do with winter. He had noticed the delay. He had noticed the charm's effect. He was patient, and patience in a being like him was a weapon sharper than any blade. Elena felt the night tilt. The diversion had worked, but she had also been seen. Cassian's lips curved into a smile that could dismantle trust. In that smile was a calculation. Whoever had made the fortress sing like rain had crossed a line. Whoever had meddled with his playthings would be given a choice: bend or break. The rest of the corridor breathed like a beast ready to pounce. Elena's lung filled with two things: the metallic tang of fear and the enduring, absurd hope that a line could be drawn and held. She had bought Victor a chance. What she had not bought was the future. That cost, she knew deep down, would be counted in more than nights. Cassian's smile was a blade slid into silk. Elena felt its edge along her spine. He rose as if the world had personally offended him and moved down from the dais with a gait that whispered privilege. The crowd parted like reeds before a prow. Victor was already gone, the procession's cracks still warm from the passage he and his handful had made toward the embankment. For a blessed, dizzy heartbeat, Elena allowed herself to believe they'd make it, that water might wash away chains and old bargains and leave new skin where grief had been. Then the world contracted. A ripple of recognition passed through the throng like a current finding a fault. The young vampire with wolf scent barked a sharp chuckle that turned sour when someone near him, a messenger with the court's livery, seized a folded scrap and read it with narrowing eyes. The scribe, drunk on the taste of being at the center of anything important, blurted the rumor into a nearby guard's ear, and the guard repeated it louder still. Elena's throat closed. She had hoped the charm's small deceit would be swallowed by the fortress's appetite for weather. Instead, the moment metastasized. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered suspicion, the sound of boots redirecting. Victor's group had reached the stair, but a rear guard snapped to attention and began to bolt back toward the hall. The men Victor had relied on, once steady as roots, froze, uncertain. Elena watched betrayal make a slow, terrible geometry, faces twisting, eyes counting coin, loyalty folding into self-preservation. The river steps were not far. The embankment gleamed like the promise of absolution. And then it was gone. The path closed with the crushing finality of a door slammed in the face of prayer. Victor swore, a sound that was part grief, part fury, and then he moved. He moved with the barbaric grace of a man who had always made his body the last defense for others, charging toward the men who had broken ranks. A knife flashed, a shout rose. Elena could hear everything, the new horrible syllables forming in Russian in the mouths around her like a chorus. They were naming names. Traitor, saboteur, witch. The word witch landed on her like a stone. She should have run. The fortress was a nest of hidden exits and worse endings. She had mapped them in her head in case necessity ever demanded flight. But she could not leave Victor to a broken attempt at salvation. He had risked his life for a chance at something better, and she had been the architect of that chance. If anyone would pay the price, she would be among them. Besides, deterrence worked both ways. If she could buy him more seconds, perhaps any fracture might be mended. Cassian's hand closed on the arm of one of the young vampires, and in the pressure she felt a decision being born. He did not rush, predators rarely did. He savored the moment before the strike, assessing which bone to break for the maximum effect. Then he gestured, a small imperial signal, and the guards surged. Men who had been caught between fear and loyalty chose the easier terror. They turned Victor and his remaining men into a spectacle. They pushed and prodded. They drug him back into view as if he were the piece of a stage set meant to evoke righteousness. The crowd, hungry for something to anchor their fear to, formed a ring. Voices that had once whispered treaties now howled for blood. Victor's eyes found Elena in the crush, and in them she saw not blame, but a raw, cavernous hurt. As if the room had been emptied of everything he'd known, and she had been the last thing standing in the doorway. He was furious at the betrayal. He was furious at hope. He looked like a man who would have taken the moon itself if it could have been used to make amends. Cassian reached the center of the ring with the deliberate grace of the practiced ruler. He placed himself between Victor and the mob, the shadow from the dais falling like a curtain. "You were always dramatic," he said in Russian, a soft, perfumed sound that Elena felt more than heard. "You made bargains without loyalty or love. You made pacts with wolves, and you expected the world to remember." Victor spat. "You write the laws, Cassian. You twist them to your taste. I did what I had to for my pack." "And you would have done it again," Cassian said. His smile didn't touch his eyes. "Which is why you must be excised." The word excised was surgical. It announced not only death, but the methodical erasure of a man who might inspire others. The crowd breathed in, readying itself to be fed. "Elena," Cassian said then, and the sound of her name in his mouth was like a summons. "Step forward." She stepped. There was nowhere to hide this time. The walls hummed with attention. Her limbs felt like cords in a puppet's hand. Yet, when she stood before the dais, she didn't see the teeth and velvet of the court so much as the shallow, painful admiration of Victor's stance. He looked at her like a man considering whether to break a vow to save a life. She almost told him to run then, to take whatever scraps of hope remained, but every instinct in her being rebelled at the offer to betray him by any excuse of survival. Cassian's eyes, dark and fathomless, studied her like a scholar reading a rare text. "You meddled with my fortress's music," he said, and his voice tightened with something that smelled like wounded pride. "You made rain where there was none." "It was a minor trick," she said. Her voice didn't carry the false bravado she might once have used. "A weather charm. It wasn't meant to hurt anyone." Cassian laughed, and in that laugh there was a history of men who believed laws were merely suggestions for the weak. "Minor charms leave major consequences," he said. "You have the gift of eavesdropping, Elena Markova. You have been a thorn in my court's side. Tell me, for whom do you drum the songs you hear? For traitors? For friends? For lovers?" The last word, lovers, landed like a spear. Victor's jaw clenched so hard the vein at his temple swelled. Elena felt it then, the fragile, tender form of something that might have been between them, exposed to the light like a bruise. She had never said what she felt, not in any language that wasn't folded in wards and small sigils. But to Cassian, everything could be leveraged. To Cassian, nothing personal remained personal. "I work for myself," she said. It was the first lie, and it felt like rubbing salt into an old wound. Cassian's gaze didn't flicker. "I will make you work for me," he said. "There are many ears in the city that would be useful to me if you were to lend them. You can live under my protection, Elena. You can have coin and safety, and, if you are obedient, privileges." His smile widened. "Or you can be demonstrated." The threat hung between them like a noose weaving itself anew. The crowd leaned in, basking in the scent of jeopardy. Victor's shoulders went taut. He did not blink. "You cannot buy her. She owes you nothing," he said. Cassian's eyes turned to Victor, and in that glance, Elena felt 100 years of weary contempt. "And what would you do, exile? Die?" There was an amused cruelty in his tone. "You have tried living as a man without my court's blessing and found it wanting. You are a leader only in memory or love. You are a danger to the balance because you think you can act without consequences." Victor said nothing. The silence was a spear. A murmur spread like oil, questions about loyalty, about bargains, about who among them had been duped into aiding the escape. Elena watched faces contour into shapes she had only seen before in the margins of treaties. The lean and hungry eyes of men whose lives depended on the favor of the powerful. She saw, with the clarity that had been a curse since childhood, who would bend and who would break. Then someone shouted. Not Cassian, not Victor, but a voice from the crowd. "Guards, seize the witch!" They moved. Like the fall of a drawn curtain, the ring collapsed. Hands closed on Elena's wrists, the same iron that had bound Victor's hands a short while before, now clasped her in a cold, efficient grip. A woman with a surveillance stare, a court warden with tattoos that read like cold runes of authority, shoved her forward and cuffed her to a post. The metal bit into her skin, a small, private pain that felt like shame. Victor lunged. "No!" he swore, a sound that broke off like a snapped wire. A guard knocked him hard in the ribs. The crowd cheered the violence as if cheering could solidify law. Elena watched him crumple like a book dropped from a shelf. Her hearing panned wildly, the rasp of cloth as men moved, the sharp intake of breath from someone who'd seen a favor lost and realized their own price. Cassian descended the dais and stood close enough that his breath, cool and refined, brushed her cheek. He crouched, an absurd intimacy from a man who otherwise maintained a cathedral of distance. "You will give me what I ask," he murmured, not loud enough for the crowd, but loud enough for her. "You will tell me who else listens. Tell me where the wolves hide their heirs. Tell me the names of those who met with this Orlov, or I will unbind the wards that hold you safe." Elena's chest ribbed with panic. To disclose what she heard was to betray more than Victor. It was to show the seams of a fragile network of people who had survived by secrecy. But to refuse was to invite a cruelty she could not imagine. Cassian unbinding the wards meant letting loose protections she had patched for years, protections for innocents who would die if the court stripped the city bare. She thought of the scribe and his ink-ready hands, of the messenger who had read the scrap, and of the dozen lesser faces she'd traded favors with. She thought of Victor, slumped on the ground, eyes searching the crowd for a truth that sistered a lie. She thought of the pack, the living creatures who might splinter into predation if their alpha were killed and their covenant erased. Cassian watched her as if he were reading an instruction manual. "Answer," he said, soft as a caress and sharp as frost. Elena's voice was small as a bone. "I know names," she admitted. "I know patterns, but I will not be the instrument that kills them." Cassian's expression didn't change. "You have no choice," he said. "You are ours now, one way or another." Victor, bandaged and furious, crawled to his feet between guards.
He saw the cuffs on Elena and the way Cassian leaned toward her, and something inside him broke like glass. Not because she was taken, that could be fixed, but because she had been taken under the eyes of a court he'd once served. For a harsh moment, he looked like a man who might finally choose himself and flee. "Elena," he said, voice ragged, "don't." She shook her head. "No," she mouthed. "Tell them nothing." Cassian smiled, amused and bored. "Such nobility," he said. Then he straightened and lifted his voice for the assembly. "This has been instructive," he proclaimed. "We will adjudicate. But I have a particular curiosity about Elena Markovas' gifts. She will come with me. We will make good use of her abilities." Elena felt the first tug when they unshackled her from the post and led her away. It was not yet the hard, white steel pain of being taken, but a little like the slow drawing of a curtain. Victor watched, a statue of rage and impotent grief. He wanted to follow. His men bound him with their own caution and fear of what an enraged public might do to any man who tried to cross Cassian in a way that risked open war. As she was led off, Elena heard one last whisper in the languages she had learned to translate for money and for survival. The court's scribe muttered, in the privacy of a records rustle, a number, a date, a future trial that spelled not only public humiliation, but a ritual. Her hearing, her curse, twisted around that syllable like a rope. The sound that filled her was not merely the court's plan, but the fracture it would cause. Names that would be exposed, families that would be fleeced, loyalties that would snap. She was dragged beneath the stone arches and through a door that led to a courtyard too small for the ambitions of those who ran it. Once inside the darker innards of the fortress, she was forced into a small cell that smelled like old dust and the sweat of defeated help. The iron door shut. The echo of its click landed in her chest like a verdict. Across the yard, from where the procession had once been, Victor's muffled shouts rose and were cut down. She pressed her palms to the cool wall. The runes she had spoken were not for these stones. They were for older bindings she could not counter with a whisper. Her gift hummed with possibility, but this place was knotted with law that would chew her soft gifts into nothing. Beneath the gate, the line that separated what she had done and what Cassian would extract from her tightened. She had warned Victor. She had tried to save him. And now, in the gray, silent cell, she recognized the other consequence that waited like a patient predator. The court had taken her, and taking her would fracture more than her freedom. It would twist trust into accusation, love into weapon, and truth into currency paid in blood. Outside, the city carried on under a moon that was unaware of the quiet, human tragedies playing out beneath its gaze. Inside, Elena sat with the heavy, burning knowledge that she had stepped into a river of consequences, and that her current had set others adrift. She had wanted to save a man. Instead, she had opened a wound that would bleed many. She thought of Victor, alone in the public square, or perhaps already bound for worse torments. She thought of the pack's faces, some loyal, some bent with fear, and of the thin, terrible thread that now ran from her mouth to Cassian's ears. She knew, with a clarity that was almost kind in its cruelty, that the fracture would widen. Some would betray, some would hide, and some would die to keep their names secret.
And in that knowledge was a seed of a different kind of plan, fragile and dangerous as a stolen spark. If she could not run, she could listen. If Cassian intended to use her, maybe she could use him. The thought was bitter and brilliant. It was not salvation. It was not even hope. But it was a thing to hold, a slice of cunning meant to cut ties before they could wrap her completely. Her hands curled into fists against the stone. The cell was dark but not silent. Beyond the heavy door, the world still moved, still murmured secrets she could not yet reach. Tears she had not intended to let fall salted her cheeks. They were small, private betrayals. For fear, for failure, for the shape of love that had been exposed and now weaponized against them. Beneath the metal chair she sat against, the faint echo of the march toward the river faded like a dream. The night pressed close, full of quiet, hungry things. Elena listened, and the listening did what it had always done. It turned knowledge into motion. She would have to become a different kind of instrument in Cassian's hands. Cunning where she had been honest, brutal where she had been gentle, silent where she had always spoken. In the damp, with the fortress breathing around her like a living thing, Elena understood the hard arithmetic of the world she had chosen to enter. Secrets multiplied, loyalties broke like brittle glass, friends became currency, lovers became liabilities, and the only way out of that geometry of pain was to break it outright. She pressed her forehead to the cool stone and made a vow so small and sharp it might have been a prayer. She would not let him die because of her mistake. She would not let the pack's wounds be stitched with her silence. If being taken meant she could learn the lines of Cassian's calculus, then she would learn them. If the court wanted her, they would have her, but not as a thrall, not if she could help it. The cell's darkness thickened until she could see it. In that deeper black, Elena wrapped her hearing around the fortress's smallest sounds, mapping the footsteps, the shifts of air, the tiny conversation between bolts, like a cartographer who measured a coastline by listening to the sea. She was a prisoner, but her mind was not yet bound. Secrets, she realized, were never all one thing. They were a map of fault lines, and maps, in the right hands, could be used to dig new passages. Outside, in the heart of the court, Cassian would plan his next move. Inside, Victor would nurse bruises into resolve or into ruin. Between them, Elena's silence would be both shield and blade. The fracture had opened. Bones would shatter. How they healed, if they healed, would be the work of sore hands and stubborn wills. In the dark, she began to listen for what might be pried loose. The bar of light under the cell door slashed across her knuckles like a question. Elena traced it with fingertips that smelled of iron and wardlore and the faint smoke of the charms she had set. The fortress hummed with plans that belonged to other mouths. Cassian's voice threaded through the corridors like polished steel. He would come for her soon, she knew. He always savored the moment before the kill, and savoring was a cruelty that gave a predator time to pick the exact angle. Her vow folded into a different thing, a plan that tasted of iron and salt. If Cassian wanted to use her to pry open the net of secrets that kept his court safe, she would give him a different instrument. She would let him believe he possessed her gifts, while she rewired the listening into a trap that would undo the legal claim he would use to justify Victor's death. It was a gamble made of thread and bone. It would bind her as surely as shackles might, and perhaps worse. She imagined being anchored to Victor's fate so that any blow Cassian leveled at the Alpha would ricochet into her. But that was the point. If her pain could be the cord that saved a pack, then pain would be currency she would spend without regret. They brought her to the chamber where Cassian presided over small cruelties. It smelled faintly of old roses and sharper promises. He did not rush. He never did. He stood like a sculpted denial of warmth and invited her to look upon him, pleased and bored in equal measure. "Elena Markova," he said, voice like silk cut by glass. "You have a lovely stubbornness. It's useful, in a way. I will make you an offer." She listened to the offer the way one listens to a knife sliding from its sheath. He would grant safety if she betrayed others. He would spare her life in exchange for her obedience. He would take Victor's blood as precedent and call it law. Her answer was already a thing she could not give. "What do you want?" she asked, and the words were steady because the world had taught her how to make her voice the only tool she trusted. Cassian smiled and unfolded a scroll like a man opening a promise. "Names, networks, the times your ears bend for another's secret. Help me stitch the pack back into its cage, and you will be rewarded. Help me remove its alpha, and you will live comfortably." There was a small crowd of courtiers, old vampires with eyes like polished coins, and they leaned forward like a congregation ready for confession. Victor's fate was being rewritten in ink and fangs, and none of them blinked at the cost. Elena saw instead the thin, archaic rune at the top of the scroll, an old binding, legal and ritual, the kind her trade sometimes touched in the margins. Cassian was not merely asking for names. He intended to stitch a legal net around the pack and its allies. She could not let him do that. To counter him, she needed to reframe the law itself. "I will help you," she said, and the words were a baited thing. She let her voice hold Cassian's attention, but on one condition. His amusement sharpened. "Name it." "Make me your instrument before the court," she said. "Let me demonstrate my gift publicly. Let me be the one you use to show the city what listening can uncover. If I am yours, then I will help you find traitors." Cassian's eyebrow lifted. That was not his usual bargain. His interest was a cat's pupil, and you think I will accept such a demonstration? "I think the court likes theater," she answered, "and I think you enjoy crowns that were placed on trembling heads." The lie was a sliver of truth. Everyone loved spectacle. Cassian more than most. He would savor the show of bending a human to his will. He considered her as one admires a fragile vase before breaking it. "Very well. A demonstration. You will stand in the hall of adjudication. You will listen and reveal. If you refuse, we unbind your wards and watch the city disintegrate." She bowed her head as if she had accepted his mercy. Inside, her hands were drafting the deeper work, a ritual that would bind her senses to Victor's life, so that any attempt to kill him under Cassian's claim would, by law and magic, implicate the court in releasing a forbidden listening. It was the kind of cleverness only half a madwoman needed. Turn the court's legalism against itself by signing a judicial witness into the same law that condemned the alpha. Cassian never suspected that she could use their obsession with codified ritual as a loophole. He believed power was lines upon lines. He did not feel the kind of fierce, stubborn tenderness that made a woman braid herself into a fate to protect the ones she loved. They led her into the hall at dawn, when the city still smelled of sleep and regret. The dais was a theater of stone, and Cassian's retinue perched like vultures. Victor, dragged, bruised, and yet dangerous in the way of wounded beasts, stood in the center like a man who had resigned to being a martyr. Their eyes met, and in them she read a question that did not need language. "Do I accept this?" Her answer was a glance and a breath and a stone-cold certainty. She would accept nothing that didn't burn her hand. She stepped forward, and when her voice rose, it was chosen to carry, to mark, to make law. "I will listen for the court," she announced. "I will tell you what I hear." Cassian's smile was predator slick. "Speak, then." Elena let her curse unspool, not by accident, but by art. She shaped what she heard into a confession that sounded like surrender. She listed names that were thinly veiled. A scribe who had sold ink for gossip. A guard who loved to gamble away his loyalties. A messenger who had a coin for every ear. Cassian's men sat back, satisfied at the harvest she promised. But the true magic was in the ritual she penned between those names. A formal binding she wove into the phrasing of her testimony. Legal language that referenced an old statute Cassian prized. The binding of witness, which declared that any legal testimony given under oath to the court would be sealed to the life it aimed to rule. Elena framed the statute to tie her testimony indelibly to Victor's fate. If Cassian argued for Victor's death based on her words, then by ancient law, the court itself would be marked as having used a living witness to justify execution. A legal paradox that, when exposed, would void the court's unilateral authority, because it would constitute an illegal use of a living instrument of testimony, according to the old codex. It was convoluted, and it depended on Cassian's appetite for spectacle. It required him to accept her words as binding public confession. He did, because he believed he could control the aftermath. He could always unbind her later. He loved such controls. Elena spoke the final line like a binding kiss. "By the statutes of the court, by my voice and my hearing, I bind this testimony to the life of Victor Orlov. Any attempt to execute him on these words becomes a mechanical impossibility without exposing the court to annulment." The hall shivered. The scribe's pen halted mid-stroke. Cassian's face did not change, but his hands tightened, an invisible storm under silk. He had been trapped by his own thirst for ceremony. If he admitted the testimony as binding, he could not remove the legal tether without unraveling decades of jurisprudence he wanted to preserve. If he refused the spectacle, he risked looking indecisive before the city. Both choices were bad for him in different ways. "You fool," he breathed, but the sound was strangled by the machinery of the law she had invoked. Victor stared at her like a man watching a miracle performed by a woman who owed him nothing and yet had given everything. He was still cuffed, and a guard's boot prodded his side, but his eyes were unfenced by calculation. In them she saw not gratitude alone, but something raw, the lover's opening, painful and beautiful. Cassian recovered with the slow grace of a man who could always find a crooked path through rules. "You believe statutes can shield you from action?" he asked, the question rhetorical. "I believe statutes are tools," she said, "and I have learned which side of them to use." He stepped closer, regal and furious. "Then we shall test your claim. If it holds, the court will be forced to admit a vulnerability. If it fails, you will be—" He let the threat hang, a promise that would have unmade lesser hearts. Elena felt fear like ice under her skin. The plan had cost her liberty. Now it demanded a deeper sacrifice. She must anchor more than law. To make the cord unbreakable, she must bind her hearing itself to Victor's heartbeat, so that any attempt on him would vibrate through her. collapsing the legal theater into incontrovertible evidence of the court's misuse. It would be intimate, legal, magical, and it would leave her tethered to whatever happened to him. She thought of the risks. Being a living attestation meant she would become a target of any who wished Victor dead. It meant pain would be her liturgy. But the alternative, letting him die to cradle the court's power, was a theft she could not abide. "I will make the binding complete," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "Let me perform the linking before witnesses. If I am connected to his life, then any attempt to execute him becomes an act against a living witness. The law will turn back on itself." Cassian's jaw worked. He could have refused. He could have killed her then and there and risked public opinion and fractured treaties. He hesitated instead. Whatever calculation crossed his face, it did not quell his hunger. "Very well," he said at last. "Prove your power. Bind yourselves, and we shall see whether your law or my will is stronger." They brought the implements of ceremony: silver chains, a circlet of binding, a recorder of oaths. Elena felt the metal against her skin like a prelude to something holy. Victor's hands trembled as the cuff that bound him was replaced by a softer ring designed to hold the ritual's weave. He looked at her with something split between awe and terror. "Elena," he said, voice low, "if it hurts—" "It will," she answered, "and I will not ask you to bear it alone." Their hands found each other as the priest, an old vampire with a face like a ledger, intoned the clauses. The ritual called for breath, for the baring of hearts, for the passing of blood between witness and subject. Elena tasted metallic fear and the old, intimate memory of tending him on a night that had nearly killed them both. She cut her palm with a nail, a small, sharp nick, and Victor did the same. Their blood met on a linen strip, and she whispered the words that would fuse her hearing to the pulse of his life. Magic is a language of exchange. Her curse, previously a passive listening, shifted into a living channel. She let it thread itself into Victor's veins like a second heartbeat. The binding was pain and song and law. She felt herself unspool. Her isolation braided into his warmth, her private curse made public by the impossibility of separation. When it was done, she could hear him in a way she had never heard another, not sound alone, but the rhythm of his blood, the small piston of his lungs, the hush of his fear and stubbornness. The connection cut across stone walls, across warded doors, across the strategies of predators. It was terrifying in its intimacy and necessary in its cruelty. Cassian's smile thinned. He had been outmaneuvered by his own vanity. The court scribes leaned forward, a sudden furious interest in procedure. The law had sung a new tune, and the melody undermined the old order. To execute Victor now would mean executing a living witness bound to his accuser's ceremony. The courts would have to answer to law they themselves had fashioned. The city watchers who survived on the thin edge of legality found the argument deliciously inconvenient. Victor's breath hitched as the binding settled. He reached for her hand, and for once the Alpha did not hide his need, nor did Elena hide hers. Their fingers laced like promises made in the open, fragile and roaring at once. "You didn't have to," he whispered. "Yes, I did," she replied. "Don't make me explain why I would choose this for you." Her laugh was a wet thing that tasted like victory and mourning. "Besides, I never had much use for quiet lives." Cassian's fury had no place to feed now but on reproach. He studied them both with a new calculation. He could still move. Power was not reduced because of one legal thorn, but his options narrowed. Publicly executing Victor would undercut his court's inviolability. He had to choose whether to push and risk revolt or to remake his plan more cleverly. He chose the first course, lunging in private. He smiled, all predator and diplomatic charm, and declared the ritual inconclusive, a neat, petty weasel of a verdict designed to buy time. Guards blocked any who would protest. Cassian would adjourn and postpone the decision until he could twist the law around this new knot. It was not a defeat so much as a delay, which in his calculus was as good as victory. But delays are strategic chances for those who can listen. Elena had tied their fates together, and in doing so, she had made Victor's life a public, legal instrument, and herself a living barrier against the court's clean brutality. She had also made herself open in a way that terrified her. Now, every attempt to harm him would be registered directly in her bones. Pain would be the witness. It was an exchange of vulnerability and cunning. As they separated the crowd, Victor slid a hand along the chain that linked them, fingers curling in an intimate gesture that steadied her like an anchor. "You risked everything," he said, words meant for only her. She met his gaze and saw a reflection of something like love there, not wholly healed, but honest in its need. "I always did," she said. "This time I chose the price." Cassian watched them with an expression that was less triumph than wounded entitlement. He had been outplayed by a human who had learned the court's language. It stung him because it proved that laws could be weaponized against creators of law. They marched Elena back to a different cell afterwards, not as prisoner, but as warded witness under Cassian's eye. The chains were finer and gilded, a mockery of freedom offered as protection. Victor was not executed that day. The city breathed a little easier, and Cassian retreated to plan his next move. Elena's sacrifice had bought a stay, not a victory. The price she had paid was made visible in the way her shoulders hunched with an invisible ache. Victor winced when she twitched as if from distant blows. The binding had done what she intended. It had turned law into shield. But it had also made her a sentinel who would feel every cut. In the dim of her new confinement, Victor found a way to speak to her across the thin rope of metal that linked their wrists. "We will find a way," he promised, and the words were both a vow and a strategy. She closed her eyes and listened to the tiny, miraculous music of his heart. It was a strange comfort, a pulse that belonged to someone she had once saved and now chose to bind to herself in full witness. The pain was a ribbon of proof, and proof in that world was often all it took to change the order of things. Outside, Cassian moved like any monarch would, replanning, invoking bureaucracy and blood until the court's machine groaned. Inside, two hands touched through iron and law. Elena's sacrifice had been the hinge they would use to pry open the court's claim, brutal, messy, and possibly fatal. Redemption had a price. She had paid it willingly. At night, when the fortress's heartbeat fell to the hush of tired guards and Cassian's footfalls in the halls sounded like decisions, Victor would whisper fragments of hope into the chain that bound them. Elena listened, feeling them as if he had been braided into her bones, and each word vibrated like a vow. They had engineered a pause in the violence. They had made the law a shield, and in the bargain, Elena had given herself over to be both witness and weapon. It was not victory. It was a reclamation of agency in a place that traded lives for spectacle. It was, in the bittersweet arithmetic of their world, the only kind of love she could afford, fierce, sacrificial, and undeniably loud. Outside, the moon climbed, impartial and old. Inside, two people bound by law and blood learned how to use pain as strategy and tenderness as armor. The war was not over. The wound was not closed. But for the first time since exile and whispers, Victor and Elena had aligned their fates by choice rather than accident. The binding sang in her ears, his name in the rhythm of his blood, and it was, impossibly, enough to make the terror tolerable. Days unfolded like careful stitches. The court postponed and plotted. Cassian sent emissaries who smiled with teeth and left with maps stained by old ink. He rebuilt his case in corners where law and hunger met. He could not easily undo what Elena had braided into statute without unraveling the very precedents that had made him lord. That gave them time, brittle, measured time, and time was, for these two, a currency they learned to spend with reverence. Victor negotiated with a new kind of authority. Not the clean arrogance of an alpha with a title, but the ragged, steadfast patience of a man who had been brought to the edge and stepped back because he refused to let his pack fall into slaughter. He moved through the city like a rumor turned into promise. Some wolves came to him with bowed heads and trembling faith. Others watched from the edges, distrust carved into their faces. He rebuilt in margins, offered protection in ways the court could not tax. He understood now that leadership was not only making decisions in a square under torches. It was returning to the small, exhaustive work of tending, of listening, of being present for hours no law witnessed. Elena learned to bend her life into the new shape the binding demanded. The link to Victor made pain a ledger she carried like a scar. When the court tested its edges, a rumor flung thin as acid, a late-night strike against a pack safehouse, she felt it in flares behind her ribs and tightened her jaw against it. Each shock registered as testimony. Each shock unfurled another defensive clause Cassian could not justify without his hands inked in the very offense he sought to commit. The cost was real. Nights she spent shivering in her cell's narrower light, hands pressed to the chain around her wrist, letting the rhythm of Victor's blood be the lullaby that steadied her. Between them, the language that had once been secrecy became a new kind of intimacy. They traded stories, small and foolish, the memory of a wound that had been mended with laughter, a stupid childhood pact not kept, a favorite spice, and those small things were scaffolding for something larger. They learned one another in the slow, intimate way people learn in war, through injury and tending, through confession and the ritual of repairing cloth and broken things. The pack healed in ragged arcs. Some mourned so loudly the city heard them. Some returned to old loyalties. Some left altogether for lives quieter than politics or pacts. When they met in the hidden glade where wolves remembered how to be a family, Victor stood and spoke with the authority of a man who had been tested and had refused to let his conscience be purchased. He said nothing grand. What he did was simple. He named the cost, thanked those who had stayed, and promised to rebuild in ways that would not require blood as bond. Elena was there in the shadows beside the fire, no longer simply the woman who listened, but the one who had chosen to become part of the chorus. People watched her with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. They saw a tiny, iron woman who had put herself on the line. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked only to be allowed to do the work she had always done: mend, ward, and listen in service rather than sell. Cassian's maneuvers continued like the grinding of an old machine, but the public had seen the binding. The law he cherished now hemmed him as surely as it had enlarged him. He retreated into subtler cruelties, testing edges that would not draw blood in ways that could be measured by the code. He was capable of waiting out seasons. Waiting was a weapon. But waiting was less lethal now, because the people he sought to cow had learned to look for loopholes, to weaponize the very language of law against him. One evening, when frost fretted the edges of the city's rooftops, Victor found Elena at the low gate of her workshop. The chains that had once been a public symbol lay now in the drawer of a desk she never opened in previous lives. The binding was their rule, not their prison. He placed a wrapped loaf on the sill, an absurdly tender offering, and slid a hand into the narrow space between iron and skin. "We will keep going like this," he said softly, not promising peace so much as continuity. "We will be loud where it matters and secret where silence keeps people safe." She leaned her forehead to his palm and felt the steady beat of the man she had bound herself to. It was a pulse that had saved and been saved. "We will," she answered, "and when he pushes too far, well, remind him that law can be a mirror." They did not pretend the future would be anything but laced with compromise and scars. Love in their world was not a balm so much as a strategy. To love meant to pick a central wound and make it into a defense. It was a fierce arithmetic that turned vulnerability into leverage and tenderness into armor. They accepted the terms. Months folded into a seasonless rhythm. Elena mended wards around homes the court could not claim by law. Victor brokered safe passages for those who had no voice. The pack rebuilt around a core of those who had remained, learning again how to trust a man who had loved and been loved back into action. The city, in its quiet ways, shifted. A whisper here, a statute challenged there. Change came in crumbs and then in loaves. On a night when the moon was a clean, pale coin, they walked to the embankment where water remembered old bargains. Frost made the stones sing under their boots. Victor unhooked a small trinket from his neck, a worn charm once used to seal pacts, and laid it between them on the ledge. "For memory," he said. Elena let the air catch in her chest, the tether between them humming the name of what they had both given. She touched the charm, and then his hand, fingers interlacing the way they always had when survival was to be shared. They watched the river take away the lights of the city like small promises offered to oblivion. The binding hummed, a private metronome that marked not only danger, but the rhythm of a life shared. They did not belong to each other in the tidy way fairy tales promised, but they had chosen a mutual taking. One heart to measure another's breath, one human to become a living law against tyranny. The moon tilted, silver and impartial, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, a quiet, watchful thing. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the sound she had cultivated her whole life, the soft, relentless beat of Victor's blood. It was both proof and prayer. Whatever came next, Cassian's patience, the court's cunning, the pack's fragile recovery, they would meet it together. In a place where treaties were written in ink and sealed with fangs, they had written a new clause in their own skin. The river flowed, indifferent and unending, and beneath the moon's devoted gaze, two people bound by law and by love let the night keep their secret, for now, and learned how to live with the music of two hearts as law enough.